Before we begin, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. I'm really hoping to break through the magical barrier of 1,000 subscribers. That number holds a special significance for me. Hit that subscribe button. It's just one click. But for me, it's a huge boost of motivation to create my next video. Thank you in advance. Don't touch her again. The maid attacked the millionaire's wife. Don't touch her again. Luciana's shriek filled every corner of the apartment, as if the very walls had shuddered. Don't touch her again. The voice wasn't a plea, it was a command. It erupted from her throat with a force she herself didn't know she possessed, echoing through the high-ceilinged living room, her yellow gloves still dripping water from the mop she had just dropped to the floor. Isabella Fuentes was on the ground, not because Luciana had pushed her. She had recoiled on her own, startled by something she hadn't expected to see in the eyes of a domestic employee. Dignity, a look that said there was a line, and she had just crossed it. Doña Amparo wept silently from her wheelchair by the window, her hands clasped on her knees, tears streaming down her face without any gesture to stop them. Her glasses had fallen to the floor in the earlier struggle. No one had picked them up yet. Rodrigo Castellanos arrived late. He always arrived late. He opened the door with his key, unaware of what he was about to find, and froze on the threshold, his hand still on the knob. His eyes swept over the scene in seconds. His wife on the floor, his maid standing, pointing at her, his mother crying by the window. He said nothing. Neither did Luciana, but she didn't lower her finger. It was Isabella who spoke first, with that voice of hers that knew exactly how to modulate to sound wounded. Rodrigo, this woman assaulted me. I want you to fire her right now. Rodrigo looked at Luciana. Luciana looked at him. There was something in that exchange of glances that lasted too long. Not the kind of pause between a boss and her employee. Something older. Something Isabella couldn't quite read, but which instinctively unsettled her. What happened here? Rodrigo asked, his voice sounding more tired than angry. Your mother, Luciana said, her tone different now, colder, stiller, but no less firm. Your wife ripped off the pendant she's worn for 40 years, the one that belonged to your father. She threw it on the floor and told her to stop crying because she was spoiling the atmosphere. The silence that followed was of a different kind. Rodrigo didn't look at Isabella. He looked at his mother. Doña Amparo nodded, her eyes barely closed, as if confirming it aloud cost her more than she could bear. Isabella rose from the floor with studied elegance, wiping her throat with the palms of her hands. They're exaggerating. It was an accident. And anyway, this employee has no right to yell at me in my own home. It's her mother's house, Luciana said without moving. Luciana, Rodrigo said, a gentle warning in his voice. Yes, Mr. Castellanos. She picked up the mop from the floor, leaned it against the wall calmly, and then stooped to pick up Doña Amparo's glasses. She returned them carefully, holding her hands for a moment. I'm done for today. If you need me, I'll be in the kitchen. She left without haste, without tears, without drama. Isabella watched her go until she disappeared down the hallway, and something in her expression shifted. It wasn't rage that was there, it was calculation. 6 hours later, Luciana sat in the small room assigned to her at the back of the apartment, her back straight, her feet on the floor, staring at the wall. She felt no regret. That was what surprised her most about herself. All her life she had learned that people like her couldn't afford the luxury of not regretting things, that there were hierarchies, and that skipping them had a cost. But not this time. There was something in the image of Doña Amparo with her glasses on the floor and her trembling hands that had extinguished all the containment mechanisms she had spent years building. Her phone vibrated. A message from her sister Natalia, from Medellin. How are you? Everything okay? Luciana took a moment before replying. Yes, everything's fine. Lying via text was easier. She turned off the screen and leaned back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. She heard footsteps in the hallway, Isabella's voice talking to someone on the phone in a low tone she couldn't quite make out, and then silence. She thought of Rodrigo, the way he had looked at her when he arrived. Not with the gaze of a man seeing his employee, but with the look of someone recognizing something he shouldn't. Did he remember her, or was she just projecting what she wanted to see? For 6 months, she had been telling herself she had come to this house for work. That the coincidence of it being his house was just that, a coincidence. that what had happened 3 years ago held no weight today. But the truth was, it did. It had. From the very first day she crossed that threshold and saw him coming down the stairs in his tie, looking at his phone, not seeing her. She had seen him and had chosen to stay anyway. What she hadn't calculated was Isabella. In the living room, Rodrigo was left alone with his mother after Isabella had gone to her room, feigning a headache. He sat opposite Doña Amparo and took her hands. "Mom, don't tell me I'm exaggerating," she replied before he could continue. "I wasn't going to say that." Doña Amparo looked at him. At 74, with her gray hair braided over her shoulder and her glasses back in place, she was still the most lucid woman Rodrigo had ever known. "The pendant belonged to your father," she said. "I know, Mom. I don't care about the pendant. Rodrigo, I care that that woman looked at me as if I were an old piece of furniture getting in the way." Rodrigo didn't answer. "Luciana looks at me, though," Doña Amparo continued in a lower voice. "That girl has something I can't explain. Since she arrived, she's the only person in this house who talks to me as if what I think still matters. You always matter, Mom. That's what you say." She squeezed his hand. "But this afternoon, when that woman threw my glasses and told me to stop crying, it was Luciana who intervened. Not you. No, Esteban. Her." Rodrigo lowered his gaze. "I have to talk to Isabella." "You've been saying you have to talk to Isabella for 6 months," his mother said softly, but without pity. And things aren't getting better. They either improve or worsen, son. They don't stay the same." Rodrigo stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the city darkening over the hills. "Hey, what do you know about Luciana, Mom? Have you asked her things?" "The kind of things you ask people when they matter to you?" "Yes." And Doña Amparo paused. "I know she's from Medellin, that she has a sister who studied something before life changed her plans." She paused. "And I know that when she says your name, there's something she controls very carefully." Rodrigo turned around. "What do you mean?" His mother looked at him with that calm she had for difficult truths. "That you control it too, and that you both think the other doesn't realize it." The silence that followed lasted a long time, and neither of them interrupted it. "The first day I arrived at this house, 6 months ago, Bogota had woken up to rain. Luciana Prado arrived at the address the agency had given her with a small backpack, work clothes folded inside, and a knot in her stomach that had been installed for 3 days and hadn't quite dissolved. The building was one of those that didn't need advertising. Glass facade, uniform doorman, clean street, the kind of place where you immediately understand there are unwritten rules, and you'd better learn them quickly. She announced herself at reception, took the elevator, and rang the doorbell for apartment 1402. A woman in her 40s with straight dark hair and eyes that assessed quickly opened the door. "Luciana Prado." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Isabella, the lady of the house. Come in." Luciana entered. The apartment was large and bright, with windows looking out onto the eastern hills, the city noise muffled by the glass. Everything was arranged with that precision that isn't cleanliness but control, everything in its place, without a trace of spontaneity. "The rules are simple," Isabella said, walking ahead of her without looking at her. "Hours are from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., Monday to Saturday. Sundays off, except for emergencies. No visitors in the house. No using the phone during work hours, except during breaks. The upstairs rooms are off limits, unless I tell you otherwise." Luciana noted it mentally. She nodded. "Do you have experience with elderly people in wheelchairs?" "Yes. I took care of my grandmother for 4 years." Isabella stopped and looked at her for the first time with something akin to attention. "My husband's mother lives here with us. She's autonomous, but needs help with certain things. Her room is on the left wing. She likes to have breakfast at 8. She likes the newspaper read to her on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She likes her coffee without sugar." A pause. "She doesn't like being treated like an invalid." "Understood. Anything else you'd like to ask?" "Does the master of the house have any special instructions?" Isabella raised an eyebrow very slightly. "My husband works a lot. He's usually not here. When he is, he doesn't bother anyone." She said it with a naturalness that was almost careless, as if describing an inventory item. "Anything else?" "No, ma'am." "Good. I'll show you your room." Doña Amparo was awake when Luciana knocked on her door for the first time, half an hour after arriving. "Come in." She was a small woman, but with a full presence. Sitting in her wheelchair by the window, a book open on her lap and her glasses perched on the tip of her nose, she looked up with the calm of someone who doesn't need to make an effort to fill the space she occupies. "You must be the new one," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Luciana Prado. It's a pleasure. Amparo Castellanos." She offered her hand, not the back for a kiss, but her whole hand, firm. "Where are you from?" "Medellin, ma'am." "And what brings you to Bogota?" "Work, ma'am." Doña Amparo looked at her for a moment over her glasses. "I know that. I'm asking what brought you here." Luciana didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the real answer was too long and too complicated for a first day. "I needed a change," she said finally. Doña Amparo nodded, as if that were enough for now. "Do you know how to play chess? The basics?" "Yes." "Good, I'll teach you what you're missing." "Do you know how to read aloud without being boring?" "I think so. We'll check that later." She closed the book and placed it on the table. "Did they make you coffee?" "No, ma'am." "Then go to the kitchen and bring me 2 cups, no sugar, mine and yours, whatever you like, and sit here." She pointed to the chair opposite her. "That hallway is too long to be going back and forth with things that don't matter." Luciana went to the kitchen and returned with 2 cups. She sat opposite Doña Amparo, and for the first time in weeks, the knot in her stomach loosened a little. Rodrigo Castellanos arrived that night at 9 p.m. Luciana was cleaning the kitchen when she heard the front door. She peeked down the hallway and saw him pass. Dark suit, loosened tie, phone in hand, held high, with that kind of fatigue that isn't physical, but a weariness of decisions. He didn't see her. Luciana stayed still, until he went upstairs and disappeared. She breathed. She had spent 6 months preparing herself for this moment, telling herself that when she saw him in person, everything would be different. That time erases, that people change, that she too had changed. And it was true that she had changed, but what she hadn't calculated was that he remained exactly the same profile, the same shoulders slightly slumped forward when he was thinking about something. The same way of not seeing what was beside him because he was too busy looking ahead. 3 years ago, that had seemed fascinating to her. Now, it seemed like a warning. The first week passed without incident. Luciana quickly learned the routines of the house. She learned that Doña Amparo had breakfast alone and read the newspaper backward, starting with the culture section. She learned that Isabella went out every day at 10 in the morning and returned around 1, sometimes with bags, sometimes without, always with the same impenetrable silence. She learned that Rodrigo disappeared before she finished serving the morning coffee and returned after she had turned off the last light. She also learned that between Isabella and Doña Amparo, there was a distance that was not merely physical. The first time she noticed it was on Wednesday. Doña Amparo had asked for an old family photo to be placed on her bedside table, a photo of her with her husband and a young Rodrigo, about 12 years old, on a trip to the coast. Luciana placed it with care. When Isabella entered the room that afternoon to leave some flowers she had bought, she looked at the photo for a second and then said in the softest voice in the world, "What times those were, when things were simpler." She said it without looking at Doña Amparo, without expecting a reply, and she left. Doña Amparo waited for the footsteps to fade away and then looked at Luciana with a calm that was more expressive than any comment. "You understand why I can't stand her," she said simply. Luciana didn't answer, but she understood. On Thursday of that first week, Rodrigo Castellanos saw her for the first time. Or, more precisely, he saw her for the first time since she had started working in his house. It was in the kitchen early, before anyone else had woken up. Luciana was preparing Doña Amparo's breakfast when he appeared in the doorway, still in his sleeping bag, his hair uncombed, searching for the coffee with his eyes before even turning on a light. "Good morning," Luciana said without turning. He stopped. "Good morning." A pause. "I hadn't seen you before. I've been here a week, ma'am." "Ah," he leaned against the doorframe. "What's your name?" "Luciana." Another silence. She continued cutting the fruit without turning around. He poured the coffee in silence. "Did my mother take to you well?" he asked from behind. "Very much. She's a great lady." "Yes," he said, with something in his voice that was pride and guilt at the same time. "She is." He left with the coffee in his hand without saying anything else. Luciana didn't turn around until she heard his footsteps recede. Then she closed her eyes for a second, just one, because Rodrigo Castellanos hadn't recognized her. And that was exactly what she had calculated, what she had needed to happen to be able to stay. But having confirmed it hurt nonetheless. That night in her room, Luciana took out from the bottom of her backpack a sheet of paper folded in 4, which she had folded and unfolded so many times that the creases almost broke it. It was the note he had left her 3 years ago. A brief handwritten note, unsigned, just 4 lines. She didn't read it, she already knew it by heart. She folded it again, put it away, and told herself for the last time that she was there for work. Only for work. That what had happened before didn't exist. That she was new. That he was different. That this story was starting here from scratch with no past. The light went out, and in the darkness of the room, Luciana Prado knew, with absolute certainty, that she was lying to herself. What Isabella knew. The discovery wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was accidental. Isabella Fuentes was not the type of woman who looked for trouble where she didn't know it existed. She was the type of woman who, when she found useful information, kept it in silence and calmly decided how to use it. It was a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Luciana arrived at the house. Isabella had forgotten her phone in the kitchen and came back to look for it before leaving. Luciana wasn't there, but her backpack was open on the chair, and a corner of a folded piece of paper with handwriting Isabella recognized was peeking out. It wasn't Luciana's handwriting, it was Rodrigo's. Isabella didn't touch the paper. She didn't need to. Seeing the strokes of that characteristic capital H, the hook of the L, was enough for her to know that what was in front of her was something that shouldn't be in her domestic worker's backpack. She heard footsteps in the hallway, grabbed her phone from the counter, and left before Luciana returned, but she already had what she needed. That afternoon, Isabella began to search. Not obviously. Isabella never did anything obviously. She started with the simple. Luciana's full name was on the contract she had signed with the agency. Luciana Prado Reyes, Medellin, 26 years old. She searched on social media. She found an almost empty profile, with no recent photos, the last post from 2 years ago. A girl who had decided to disappear from the digital world, or who had never had much presence in it. She searched more, and in a private group of former students from a university in Medellin, she found what she didn't expect. A photo from 4 years ago, a small, informal graduation, from an extension course in literature and creative writing. 12 people smiling, with certificates in hand. Luciana Prado was in the center of the photo, and next to her, with his hand on her shoulder, and a smile that Isabella knew very well, was Rodrigo Castellanos. Isabella closed the phone screen, sat in the car in the shopping mall parking lot for 12 minutes without moving. Rodrigo had never mentioned that woman to her, had never said her name, and yet, there they were in a photo from 4 years ago with that kind of physical closeness that you don't have with a stranger. The course had lasted 3 months. Isabella looked it up. Rodrigo had gone through a strange phase right after the death of his first marriage, when he wasn't yet the businessman he was now. He had taken strange courses, had done things that didn't fit with the man she had decided to marry. How long had whatever happened between them lasted? How deep had it gone? And why had Luciana Prado appeared at his house exactly now? Isabella didn't believe in coincidences. She had never believed in them. From that day on, Isabella changed. Not suddenly. That would have been clumsy. She did it the way she knew. Gradually. Surgically. Without anyone being able to point to an exact moment when things had gone wrong. With Luciana, she began to be demanding in ways that couldn't be complained about. The terrace floor has marks. Go over it again. Mrs. Amparo's clothes smell of fabric softener. She doesn't like the smell of fabric softener. Didn't I tell you? We're not having lunch here today, so you can take the free time to clean the upstairs bathrooms. All of them. Every instruction came with a perfectly neutral voice. No obvious harshness. Just work. Just demands. The kind of pressure that leaves no marks but accumulates weight. Luciana obeyed without complaint, without comment, but Doña Amparo observed. The old woman had that capacity of people who have lived long enough to see what happens in the space between words. She saw how Isabella assigned Luciana the heaviest tasks. Just when she had sat down, she saw how she asked her double-edged questions disguised as conversation. One Wednesday, while Luciana was reading her the newspaper aloud, Doña Amparo interrupted her. "What did you do to Isabella?" Luciana looked up from the newspaper. "Excuse me, don't make me repeat the question." Luciana lowered the newspaper slowly. "Nothing, ma'am. That's not true." Doña Amparo looked at her with that serenity of hers that was sharper than any interrogation. Isabel isn't a woman who bothers for the sake of bothering. When she hurts, it's because she wants something or because she's afraid of something. Which of those two applies to you? Luciana didn't answer immediately. "I don't know, Doña Amparo." "Yes, you do." The silence between them lasted long enough for both to understand that there was a truth there that neither was going to utter yet. "Continue reading," Doña Amparo said at the end, and Luciana continued reading. What Isabella didn't calculate was that pressure also produces reactions. 3 weeks after she started with the demands, she told Luciana to clean Rodrigo's study, the room that until then had been out of her reach. "The entire wardrobe, the high shelves, everything," Isabella said. "Rodrigo is going to have a meeting here on Friday, and I want it to be impeccable." Luciana entered the study with the cleaning cart. It was a room that smelled of paper and that kind of orderly disorder that men who work a lot have. Marked books, stacks of folders with a certain logic, a whiteboard with half-erased diagrams. On the wall, several framed acknowledgments, photos of constructed works, the progression of a man who had reached where he was through hard work. Luciana cleaned carefully, without touching anything that wasn't necessary. As she was cleaning the highest shelf, she saw it. Between an architecture book and a file box was an unopened envelope, with no sender, her name handwritten on the front, Luciana Prado. The handwriting was the same as the note in the backpack, the same handwriting as Rodrigo's. Luciana took the envelope down with hands that didn't tremble, because she forced them not to. She looked at it. It was old. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. It had been there for a while. How long? Since before she arrived? Or had he put it there afterward? She heard footsteps in the corridor, Isabella's, who had that way of walking on her heels that Luciana already recognized from afar. She quickly put the envelope in the pocket of her apron and continued cleaning. Isabella opened the door. "How's it going?" "Well, ma'am, I'm almost done." Isabella scanned the room. Her eyes stopped for a second on the high shelf. Then they looked at her. "Good," she said. "Make it perfect." And she left. That night, locked in her room, Luciana opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, written on both sides. Rodrigo's handwriting, more nervous than usual, as if he had written it in a hurry or with shaky hands, began without a greeting. "I know you don't have to read this. I know I have no right to write to you after what happened, but there's something you needed to know, and that I didn't have the courage to tell you in person." Luciana read the letter twice. When she finished, she folded it carefully and put it away with the first note in the bottom of her backpack, where she had also kept the things she couldn't throw away, even though she knew carrying them had a cost. She turned off the light, and for the first time since she had arrived at that house, she cried. Not much, not out loud, just enough for the weight of 3 years to find a way out. The secret she had carried alone 3 years ago, Rodrigo Castellanos, was not the man he is today. He was younger in his ways, though he was the same age. He had come out of a marriage that lasted 4 years, and that broke without scandal and without love, like things that were never properly stuck together break. His company existed, but it was small, and he still had that kind of hunger that is not ambition, but a need to prove something to himself. The creative writing course was the idea of a friend, a psychologist, who told him he needed to do something with his hands other than signing contracts. Rodrigo went the first night with the attitude of someone fulfilling a formality. Luciana arrived late, that first night. She entered while the instructor was already speaking. She settled into the only free chair and took out a notebook that already had written pages. Rodrigo noticed because it was the most used notebook of all the ones in the room. They didn't speak that night. The second week, the instructor paired them up to review what they had written. Rodrigo and Luciana were paired together. She read her text. It was a clumsy fragment about a construction site seen from the inside, full of technical data disguised as metaphors. Luciana listened to him read, and when he finished, she said, "You're not describing the construction site, you're describing how you feel inside it." Rodrigo looked at her. "What do you mean? Everything you've written is about control, about measuring, about everything being in its place so the building doesn't fall down." Ella closed his notebook and handed it back to him. "This wasn't a text about construction," she said. "It was a text about fear." No one had said anything like that to her in a long time, perhaps never. For the next 8 weeks, they met every Tuesday. At first, they only talked about the texts. Then they started staying a while after class in the downstairs cafe with the coffee that closed at night. And it was in those conversations that Rodrigo learned who Luciana Prado was. She came from a family with no money, but with books. Her mother sewed and her father was a driver. She had studied literature at the public university, but had to drop out after 2 years when her mother fell ill. She got whatever work she could: cashier, receptionist, office assistant. She had paid for the writing course in 3 installments. What she never told him What Rodrigo didn't know until much later was what she carried beneath it all. Luciana had a son, a 7-month-old baby named Samuel, who lived with Luciana's sister in Medellin while she worked in Bogotá to send money. A son that no one in that house knew existed, that no one in Bogotá knew existed, because Luciana had learned that when you are a woman, alone and poor, and you have a child, doors close behind you. Samuel was the secret she carried alone. The father had disappeared before Luciana knew she was pregnant, without drama, without violence. He simply stopped answering the phone one day, and she understood he was the kind of person who vanished when things got complicated. Luciana had decided that wouldn't define her, that Samuel wouldn't grow up knowing his father had chosen not to be there, that he would grow up knowing his mother had chosen to always stay, even if it cost her everything. What happened with Rodrigo wasn't planned. It happened in the 10th week of the course. On a Tuesday in November, when Bogotá rained in that way that only Bogotá rains, as if the sky had decided it had had enough of half measures. They had stayed in the cafe longer than usual, talking about nothing in particular, the way people talk when they already know enough about each other to not need conversation topics. Rodrigo told her his company was about to take a big leap, a contract with the municipality that could change everything. She listened and asked if that was what he wanted or what he needed to prove. Rodrigo was silent for a moment. Both, he said finally, honestly. That's fine, Luciana said, as long as you know which is which. Outside it kept raining. Inside the place was closing, and the waiter gave them a discreet warning. They left together under Luciana's umbrella, because Rodrigo didn't have one. Walking slowly, even though they both had somewhere to go. At the corner where they were supposed to part, they stopped. And it was Rodrigo who looked at her in that way that needs no explanation. I don't think this is a good idea, Luciana said. No, he agreed, but neither of them moved. What happened next was brief, and it was real. It wasn't a story. It wasn't the beginning of anything that could be called that. It was a night, 2 people, and the honesty of knowing that what was there was genuine, even if it had no name or clear future. The following week, Rodrigo didn't go to the course. The week after, he didn't go either. Luciana waited for him 2 more Tuesdays. Then she stopped waiting. What she learned later, she learned from the instructor, casually. A month later, Rodrigo had secured the municipal contract. His company had taken the leap. He was working 15 hours a day. He had moved to live in North Bogotá. The instructor said it with admiration. Luciana nodded and asked nothing more. What she didn't know, what they never told her, was that Rodrigo had tried to contact her, that he had looked for her, that he had left a note at the academy's address because he didn't have her number, that he had later written a letter that he kept because he had nowhere to send it. Luciana learned that 3 years later, the night she opened the study's envelope, and there was the hardest secret to carry, not Samuel's, but the knowledge that Rodrigo had looked for her, and she never knew, that things hadn't ended by his choice, but by a mistake, by a chain of small things that each interpreted wrongly without being able to know. 3 lost years. Samuel was now 2 years and 10 months old. Luciana called him every night from her room in a low voice when the house slept. Her sister Natalia would hold the phone to the child's ear, and he would say, "Mom," with that voice of yours that still didn't string sentences together, but that already had firm opinions on everything. "Mom, come. Soon, my love, soon." It was what she always told him. And soon was a promise that depended on things Luciana didn't entirely control. She had come to Bogotá for work. Yes, that was true. She needed the money for Natalia's rent, for diapers, for the doctor, for the things that cost and never stop costing. But she had also come because a part of her, the part that didn't obey logic, wanted to know what had really happened. She wanted to see if what she had felt that rainy night had been real, or if memory had idealized it into a lie. And now that she knew, now that she had read the letter, she was more lost than before, because the letter confirmed it, because Rodrigo hadn't disappeared by choice, and because Rodrigo Castellanos was now married to another woman, and that woman already knew something, and Luciana could feel it in every extra request, in every calculated glance, in every instruction that arrived a little more charged than the last. Isabella knew, not everything, but enough. And that meant that the time Luciana had to decide what to do with the truth she carried was getting shorter and shorter. Samuel said her name every night with the absolute certainty of children who don't yet know the world can fail. And Luciana, on the other side of the phone, answered him with the same certainty, even if it was hard to maintain. I'm here, my love. I'm here. The cracks in the marriage. Esteban Peña had been Rodrigo Castellanos' trusted lawyer for 12 years. He had met Rodrigo when he was a medium-sized builder with big dreams and reasonable debts, and he had seen the rise from the inside with the privileged and sometimes uncomfortable perspective of someone who knows too much. He arrived at the apartment on a Thursday at 7 p.m. with a folder under his arm, and that expression of a man who has something to say and is measuring how to say it. Rodrigo received him in the study. Luciana brought them coffee and withdrew without anyone asking her to. She had that ability to read spaces. Esteban waited for the door to close. "Who is that woman?" he asked. "The employee. She's been here for 2 months. From what agency?" Rodrigo looked at him strangely. "Why?" "Because Isabella called me last week to ask if it was possible to check the work history of a domestic employee outside the normal channels." Esteban placed the folder on the desk, and when I asked him who, he gave me that name. Luciana Prado. The silence that followed was brief, but dense. "What did you tell her?" "That it wasn't my area, and that it wasn't a good idea." Esteban leaned back in his chair. "Rodrigo, what's going on in this house?" "Nothing I can't handle." "That's what you told me 2 years ago when you signed the marriage contract without reading the entire property clause." Rodrigo clenched his jaw. "Esteban, I'm telling you because it's my job to tell you. Isabella has been acting in ways I don't understand for weeks. She's asked for information about accounts that aren't the usual ones. She's consulted with a notary who isn't me, and now she wants to investigate your employee. That's not a woman who's calm in her marriage, that's a woman who's building something." Rodrigo stood up and walked to the window. The hills were covered in low clouds that night. "What kind of accounts?" "The ones for the trusts we set up 3 years ago. The ones that hold the company's assets before the merger. Those accounts are in my name." "Yes. But in the marriage contract, there's a clause for participation in profits accumulated during the marriage that you signed without me reviewing it first." Esteban opened the folder. If someone with a good lawyer decides to interpret it a certain way, there's an argument for claiming participation in the value generated in the last 18 months. Rodrigo turned around. "Are you telling me Isabella is preparing an exit?" "I'm telling you, someone is asking questions that only make sense if you're planning an exit." A pause. "I'm not telling you it's her. I'm telling you to open your eyes." Rodrigo didn't sleep well that night. Not because Esteban's information had destroyed him, but because it fit. It fit with small things he had been ignoring for months, because ignoring them was more comfortable than facing them. The way Isabella talked about the house as if it were a project, the way she avoided certain topics with an almost too rehearsed fluency, the fact that in 18 months of marriage, she had never mentioned wanting children, or long-term plans, or anything that implied a shared concrete future. Rodrigo had interpreted that as independence, as a modern woman who didn't need to define everything. Now he wondered if it had been naivety. At 2 a.m., he got up for water. The kitchen was dark. The hall light was barely enough to see where he was stepping. Luciana was sitting at the kitchen table, doing nothing, just sitting, with her hands around a mug that must have been cold, looking out the window at the building's inner courtyard. Rodrigo stopped at the entrance. "Can't sleep?" he asked in a low voice, so as not to wake anyone. Luciana looked at him in the dim light, without her work uniform, her hair down, and an expression that hadn't had time to put its guard up. She looked younger and more real than at any other moment since she had arrived. "Sometimes not," she said. Rodrigo poured water. He hesitated. He sat down on the other side of the table. They were silent for a moment, both looking at the same window that had nothing interesting on the other side. "Do you have family in Medellin?" he asked, and he didn't know exactly why he asked. "A sister misses me always." Another silence, more comfortable than the previous one. "How long have you been working like this?" Rodrigo asked. "Since I was 22, with interruptions." "What did you study before?" Luciana looked at him. It was an innocent question, said with the naturalness of late-night conversations, when people ask things they wouldn't ask during the day. But for her it wasn't innocent. It was the edge of a territory she couldn't tread on. "Things," she said simply. Rodrigo nodded. He didn't insist. "My mother says you're the best person who has entered this house in years." Luciana didn't answer immediately. "Your mother is very generous." "My mother isn't generous. She's precise. When she says something like that, it's because she truly means it." The silence that followed had a different weight. They both felt it, they both chose not to name it. Rodrigo stood up. "Good night, Luciana." "Good night, Mr. Castellanos." He was already leaving when she spoke again, almost unintentionally. "The study's envelope." Rodrigo stopped with his back to her. I found it while cleaning. It's in the left drawer of the desk. I put it there. A very short pause. I didn't open it. It was a lie. They both knew it. Rodrigo didn't turn around. Thank you, he said. And he kept walking. Isabella saw them from the hallway. She hadn't gone out for water. She had heard footsteps and had come out to see. And now she stood in the shadow of the corridor, far enough not to be seen, close enough to have heard almost everything. She didn't hear the exact words, but she heard the tones, the length of the silences, the way Rodrigo's voice changed when he spoke to that woman. She knew that voice. It was the voice Rodrigo no longer used with her. Isabella returned to the bedroom without a sound, slipped into bed, closed her eyes, and began to calculate with the coldness of someone who had already decided that the time for observing was over. The next day, Isabella tasked Luciana with organizing the guest room closet, an unnecessary chore in a room no one used. Luciana went without asking. Once she was inside, Isabella locked the door from the outside. Luciana heard the click, stood still for a moment, then tried the knob. Locked. She knocked calmly twice. Señora Isabella, silence. Señora Isabella, the door is locked. Nothing. Luciana sat on the edge of the bed in the empty room and waited. She knew this was a demonstration, a way of telling her, I can do this to you. I can lock you up wherever I want. I can remind you who's in charge here. 40 minutes later, Doña Amparo called Isabella from her room, asking for Luciana. And Isabella, with all the calm in the world, went to open the guest room door. How strange, she said, looking at the lock. These old doors sometimes jam on their own. Luciana came out without saying a word. But that night, before calling Natalia to speak with Samuel, she looked up the employment agency's number on her phone, not to quit, but to have the number handy, just in case. Esteban Peña returned to the apartment the following Friday, but this time he didn't go to the study. He went to the living room, where he found Doña Amparo alone having tea, and sat with her for a moment, while he waited for Rodrigo. How are you, Doña Amparo? Old and lucid, she replied, which is the worst combination possible because you see everything and can't do anything. Esteban smiled. What do you see that others don't? Doña Amparo looked at him over her glasses, with that familiar patience she reserved for people who ask questions to which they already know the answer. I see that my son married a woman who is calculating the value of this house. A pause. And I see that there's another woman in this house who is trying not to love my son, and she's doing a very bad job of it. Esteban placed his cup on the table. Have you said any of this to Rodrigo? I told him that things don't stay the same. They get better or worse. He sighed. It seems they chose to get worse before getting better. And what do you recommend, Doña Amparo? She thought for a moment. That someone ask Luciana Prado what she came to this house looking for. She looked at him directly. She didn't just come to clean floors. I've known that since day one, and I think it's time someone else knew it too. What she did when no one was looking. Isabella Fuentes had learned from a very young age that money wasn't a goal, it was a tool. And like any tool, its value depended entirely on knowing how to use it at the right moment. She grew up in Cali, in a family that had money and had lost it, with the discreet elegance of those who prefer to pretend they never had it. Her father was a man of appearances. Her mother, a woman who channeled all her intelligence into marrying well, and then into teaching her daughter to do the same. Isabella had learned the lesson, but she had improved upon it. She wasn't looking to marry well, she was looking to marry strategically. What for her mother was an end, for her was an instrument. Rodrigo Castellanos had appeared on her radar 3 years ago. When his company was truly starting to grow, she met him at an investment event. He was attractive in that solid, understated way that men who have built what they have possess. He didn't boast, he didn't need to. It took Isabella 6 months to cultivate the relationship, another 4 to make it solid. And when Rodrigo proposed marriage, she already knew the approximate value of every asset he owned. The plan was simple in its structure, and complex in its execution. To build a marriage that seemed genuine, long enough to secure a legal position over the assets. The marital contract's patrimonial clause hadn't been an oversight on Rodrigo's part. It had been Isabella's suggestion, presented through a trusted lawyer as a standard formality. Esteban Peña had never liked her. Isabella knew that from the first moment, and had managed it by keeping him out of the decisions that mattered. What she hadn't calculated was that Esteban was more perceptive than he seemed. The Monday after the locked room incident, Isabella met with her contact, not at the apartment, but at a cafe in the north of the city, at a back table with 2 cups of tea that neither of them touched. The man's name was Gerardo Rios, a lawyer, a specialist in patrimonial law, and in finding the edges of what is legal without crossing them entirely. "How are we doing?" Isabella asked. "The clause is solid if we interpret it under the article we discussed, but we need to document the contribution to the consolidation of assets during the marriage. Emails, presents and decisions, anything that shows active participation." "I have it." "How much?" "Enough. I participated in 3 board meetings in the first 6 months. There are minutes with my name as an observer, and there are 2 emails where Rodrigo consulted me on expansion decisions." Gerardo nodded slowly. "That helps. When do you want to move?" Isabella clasped her hands on the table. "There's a complication." "What kind?" "A domestic employee who knows more than she should." Gerardo waited. "She has a relationship with my husband from the past. I don't know exactly how deep it was, but she's in that house for a reason, and that reason isn't cleaning floors. She represents a legal risk. Not directly, but if Rodrigo hears her before I make my move." Isabella left the sentence unfinished, because unfinished sentences were more eloquent than complete ones. "What do you need?" "For her to disappear." Isabella lifted her teacup for the first time. Without drama, without anyone being able to trace a line back to her, Gerardo looked at her. "What do you have against her?" "That's what I'm looking for." What Isabella didn't know was that Luciana had already discovered it. It had been 3 days earlier, a Friday afternoon. Luciana was cleaning the terrace when she heard Isabella talking on the phone in the adjoining living room, the door ajar and her voice loud enough for the words to come through loosely, but recognizably. She didn't hear everything, she heard enough. Trusts, the patrimonial clause before Rodrigo changes his mind. Luciana stopped sweeping. She listened for 2 more minutes. Then she continued sweeping, as if she hadn't heard anything. That night she didn't call Natalia. She stayed in her room with her phone in her hand, staring at the ceiling, doing what she did when she needed to think clearly, organizing information as if it were a text that needed structuring. What she had heard wasn't a couple's conversation. It was a strategy conversation. Isabella was planning something that had to do with Rodrigo's money, with his company's assets, and she was planning it for before something changed. The dilemma was as old as the world and as impossible as ever. What was Luciana to do with it? If she said nothing, Rodrigo would lose what he had built over years, and would lose it without knowing, without being able to defend himself. If she said something, she would have to explain how she knew. And explaining how she knew would involve explaining why she was paying attention to what Isabella was saying on the phone. And Isabella had the photo, she had the story of the course. She could build a narrative that Rodrigo might choose to believe, because it was easier than the truth. And if she explained, she would also have to explain everything else. Samuel, the letter, why she had really come to that house, all of it. At the same time, without preparation, Luciana closed her eyes, thought of Samuel saying, "Mom, come," with that voice of hers that was full of certainty. She thought of Rodrigo's letter that said, "There's something you needed to know." She thought of Doña Amparo with her glasses on the floor and her hands trembling, and she decided she would wait, not out of cowardice, but because she needed to know more before speaking. Because if she was going to open that door, she needed to open it with everything inside, not halfway. The opportunity arrived on its own, as things often do when one has stopped searching for them urgently. The following Wednesday, Isabella left at 10, as usual. Rodrigo was at a construction site. Doña Amparo was taking a nap. Luciana was organizing the study when she saw that Isabella's laptop had been left open on the living room sofa, unlocked. The screen was on. She stopped at the entrance to the living room. She didn't go in. She stood on the threshold, looking at the screen from a distance. She couldn't read what it said from there, but she could see that an email window was open, and that the name in the header of the last message was not one she recognized. Gerardo Rios. Subject: Additional documentation, Stage 2. Luciana looked down the hallway. She looked at the screen, then back at the hallway. She didn't go in. She returned to the study and continued cleaning. But she memorized the name, and that night, from her room, she searched for Gerardo Rios on the internet. Lawyer, Cali, specialist in patrimonial litigation and property division. Everything was there. She didn't need to see the email. The name and specialty were enough to understand the complete picture. Esteban Peña arrived at the apartment that same Wednesday afternoon before Isabella had returned. He asked for Rodrigo. Luciana told him he wasn't there. Esteban nodded. Then, instead of leaving, he paused at the entrance. "May I ask you something?" he said. Luciana looked at him. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly. "Of course. It's fine here." It was a strange question coming from where it came. Luciana held it for a moment before answering. "Yes, it's fine." "Why are you asking me that, Dr. Peña?" Esteban studied her for a moment with that lawyer's gaze that knows that the answers matter less than what isn't said. "Because Doña Amparo asked me to ask you." A pause. "And because I've known Rodrigo Castellanos for 12 years, and something in this house isn't right, and I'm not the only one who sees it." Luciana remained silent. "If at any point you need to talk to someone," Esteban said, leaving his card on the hall table, "call me. Not as Rodrigo's lawyer, but as someone who wants things to turn out well." He left. Luciana took the card, looked at it, and put it in her apron pocket next to her phone. That night, she called Natalia. "Nati, I need you to look after Samuel for a little longer." Her voice was calm, but Natalia knew her too well. "What's going on, Lou?" "Nothing yet, but I think soon it will all happen at once." "Are you okay?" Luciana looked at Esteban's card on the small table. "I'm fine." A pause. "Can you put Samuel on?" She heard the child's voice on the other end. The background noise of a small apartment in Medellin. The sound of everything that was waiting for her. "Mom, hi my love." "Mom, come." "I'm coming," Luciana said. Almost. And this time, when she said it, it sounded less like a promise and more like a decision. The night everything broke was a Thursday. There were no prior signs that this day would be any different from the previous ones. The apartment woke up with the same usual silence. Coffee at 8, Doña Amparo's newspaper, Isabella's comings and goings with that heel rhythm Luciana already knew by heart. Rodrigo had left early, a meeting at the new construction site in the south of the city. Esteban had called him the night before to confirm they would meet at noon. Luciana made the beds, cleaned the bathrooms, prepared Doña Amparo's lunch, all with the calculated normality of someone who knows something is approaching, but doesn't know exactly when it will arrive. What arrived was at 11 in the morning. Doña Amparo was in her room by the window with her book on her lap and her glasses in place. Luciana had stepped in to leave a cup of warm water when Isabella appeared at the door. She never knocked. She entered with the casual ease of someone who considered every space in that house equally hers. She stood in the center of the room, looking at Doña Amparo, with an expression Luciana had never seen before, something more open than usual, something that in another person might have seemed like vulnerability, but in Isabella felt like the first move in a game. Doña Amparo said, "I need to speak with you." The elderly woman slowly closed her book and looked at her. "Then speak." Isabella entered fully. Luciana picked up the previous cup from the side table and prepared to leave. Isabella stopped her with her voice. "Stay, Luciana. This concerns you too. You deserve to hear it." Luciana froze. A chill ran down her spine. Isabella sat in the chair opposite Doña Amparo, crossed her legs and spoke with a practiced calm. "I've decided I'm going to ask Rodrigo for a divorce." Doña Amparo said nothing. "I know this affects you as well, and I wanted to tell you before I spoke with him. Out of respect." "Out of respect," the elderly woman repeated, her tone not a question but an observation. "This marriage isn't working. Rodrigo and I have different visions of what we want. It's better for both of us to separate now than to continue building something with no future." Doña Amparo looked at her for a long moment. "And my son's company assets, are you separating those too?" Isabella didn't blink. "That's a legal matter that the lawyers will handle justly." "Your lawyers? Or his?" A brief silence. "Doña Amparo, I understand this is difficult, but I ask you not to dramatize it. These things happen." Luciana watched from the corner. She watched Doña Amparo, whose fingers were clenched on the book's cover, her knuckles slightly white. She watched Isabella, who maintained her composure with her usual technical precision. And then, Doña Amparo said something no one expected. "Do you know what hurts me most about you, Isabella?" Isabella waited, expecting she wouldn't have the courage to truly want it. The elderly woman's voice was low, but each word landed with its own weight. "Rodrigo is a man who has made mistakes, who has been alone for too long, who needed someone to see him, not to quantify his worth. And you chose the latter. I didn't come here to be judged. No, you came to announce you're taking what isn't yours. and wanted to do it by looking me in the eye to see if I would break. Doña Amparo opened the book again. I'm not going to break. I already did when my husband died. Everything after that has been easier than that. Isabella stood up, and it was then, in that moment of rising, that something in her also broke. Not her entire composure, just an edge, enough for what she said next to have a different temperature than anything before. This woman, she said, pointing at Luciana without looking at her, is not here for work. She's here because she has something with your son. And if you believe that's better than what Rodrigo has with me, you're more blind than you appear. Doña Amparo looked at Luciana. Luciana didn't lower her gaze. You've both been here in this house, Isabella continued. And now there was a sharpness in her voice, looking at them as if no one else could see, and you protecting her as if she were family. She is not. She's an employee who came looking for something that doesn't belong to her. Isabella, Luciana said softly. Don't speak to me, Isabella. Lower your voice. I told you not to speak to me. She turned to her for the first time, and in her eyes was something that was no longer calculation, but rage, the real rage of someone who had been controlling herself for too long. You have no place in this conversation. You clean floors, that's what you are. The silence that followed lasted a second, just one, and in that second, Isabella made the mistake that everything before had been building towards. One no one could prevent. She reached for Doña Amparo's pendant, the same pendant as always, the one that belonged to her husband, and took it between her fingers with a brusqueness that wasn't an accident, but a demonstration. These kinds of things, she said, are exactly the problem, clinging to old objects instead of looking forward. And she pulled. The delicate chain resisted for a second before giving way. Doña Amparo let out a short sound of pain, and something deeper than physical pain. Her glasses hit the arm of the chair and fell to the floor. Luciana was already in motion before the pendant finished falling. She didn't run. She went straight. She placed herself between Isabella and Doña Amparo, with her whole body, and when Isabella tried to step aside to go around her, Luciana raised her hand and stopped her, with a firmness that wasn't violence, but also left no room for negotiation. Don't touch her again. The voice came from a place Luciana didn't know she had. It wasn't an immediate cry, but something before the cry, denser, more real. Isabella took a step back in surprise rather than fear, and then Luciana pointed down, at the floor where the pendant had fallen, her finger steady, her gaze fixed. Pick it up. You're not going to give me orders in my own home. Pick it up. Isabella looked at both of them, at Luciana standing, blocking the way, at Doña Amparo with trembling hands and closed eyes. And it was at that moment that the apartment door opened. Rodrigo had returned early. The meeting had been canceled. Esteban had sent a message at 10:30 saying the client had requested a reschedule. Rodrigo had decided to go home to get some documents he needed for the afternoon. He found his mother's door ajar. He entered and froze in the doorway, his hand on the knob. He saw Luciana standing, pointing at the floor. He saw Isabella with his mother's pendant in her hand. He saw his mother in her chair, her eyes still closed, her hands clenched on her knees. He didn't speak immediately. He lowered his gaze to the floor, saw the glasses, and calmly picked them up. He brought them to his mother and carefully put them on her. Doña Amparo opened her eyes and looked at him, and in that look was everything that couldn't be said. At that moment, Rodrigo straightened up and turned to Isabella. She still had the pendant in her hand. Give it to me, Rodrigo said. His voice was flat, devoid of recognizable emotion, the kind of voice someone uses when they're controlling something very large with great effort. Isabella released it into his palm without a word. Rodrigo returned it to his mother. He placed it around her neck himself, his hands trembling just enough for Luciana to see from where she stood, though no one else would notice. Then he turned back to Isabella. Leave this room, Rodrigo. I need you to listen. Leave this room now. Isabella left. Rodrigo looked at Luciana. She held his gaze for a second, then went to pick up the glasses from the floor, even though he had already picked them up, just to have something to do with her hands. Thank you, Rodrigo said, his voice very low. Luciana nodded without a word. He followed Isabella out and closed the door. Doña Amparo continued to look at Luciana. Sit down, she said. Luciana sat. The elderly woman took her hand. She said nothing for a long moment, just held her hand with that firmness of someone who has learned that silence can be the most complete way of saying something. Is it done? She said finally, her voice very low. Yes, And Luciana, who had endured everything without breaking, had to look towards the window so Doña Amparo wouldn't see that her eyes had filled with water. In the living room, Rodrigo and Isabella were alone for 20 minutes. What they said didn't reach Doña Amparo's room, only the tones. Rodrigo's, low and steady. Isabella's, which started controlled and rose until it lost the form it always maintained. When Isabella left for the hallway with her purse in hand and car keys, she passed Doña Amparo's room without stopping. Before reaching the main door, she paused for a moment in front of Luciana's room. She didn't enter, just stood there with her back to the hallway, looking at the closed door. "This isn't over," she said, in a volume that was only for herself, or perhaps for Luciana, if she were nearby, to hear. Then she left, and the apartment settled into a silence different from all the others. The silence of things already said, and that can no longer be unsaid. What Rodrigo didn't know. Esteban arrived at 3 in the afternoon. Rodrigo hadn't called him. Doña Amparo had called him from her room, with a calm that admitted no discussion. "Come now, Esteban. Today, what had to break has broken, and now what remains must be fixed." Esteban arrived with the folder he had been preparing for weeks, the one Rodrigo hadn't fully asked to see yet, but which Esteban had been building regardless. Because 12 years of knowing a man teach you when to prepare even if he doesn't ask. Rodrigo was in the study when he arrived, sitting, no papers in front of him, no phone in his hand, just sitting, looking at the whiteboard with half-erased diagrams. Esteban closed the door. "How are you?" "Fine. You don't look fine." Esteban sat down opposite him. "She left. She went to the apartment she has in Chapinero." "I think she's had it for a while." Rodrigo said it without emphasis, as if he had already processed that part. "This afternoon, she sent me a message saying we would speak through her lawyer, Gerardo Rios." Rodrigo looked at him. "Do you know him?" "I know who he is and what he does." Esteban opened the folder. "Rodrigo, I need you to read this today, not tomorrow, today." What was in the folder were 3 things. A copy of the marital contract's asset clause, with marginal annotations. A summary of the consultation movements Gerardo Rios had made regarding companies related to Rodrigo's business in the last 2 months. And a letter of intent for separation dated 3 weeks ago. Rodrigo read in silence. Esteban let him read. When he finished, Rodrigo closed the folder and placed it on the desk with excessive care, as if he needed that small gesture to avoid making a larger one. 3 weeks, he said. "She signed it before today's events. Today wasn't spontaneous, Rodrigo. It was the execution of something planned. And the clause, how solid is her position? She has arguments. They're not perfect, but with the right lawyer and the right judge, she can build a case." A pause. "That's why we need to move quickly. And that's why I need you to tell me everything you know about what she's been doing these past months. Meetings, calls, people she's seen." Rodrigo nodded and began to speak. They were in the study for an hour. When they emerged, Esteban had enough to start building the defense. And Rodrigo had that expression of men who have just realized that something they thought solid was paper from the start. Luciana heard the study door open. She was in the kitchen preparing Doña Amparo's dinner, her phone on the counter, Natalia's message still unanswered. She heard Esteban say goodbye, heard his footsteps heading towards the exit, and then she heard Rodrigo's steps coming towards the kitchen. She prepared herself. Rodrigo entered. He leaned against the doorframe, just like that night in the first week, before everything became what it was now. "How is my mother?" he asked, resting. "She ate well." Luciana continued cutting without turning around. "She's calm. Good." A pause. "Luciana." "Yes. I need to ask you something." She put the knife down on the board and turned around. Rodrigo was looking at her with an expression that wasn't that of a boss or a tired man in the early hours. It was something harder to name, something he was calculating if he could afford. "I need you to tell me the truth about something." Luciana waited. "Isabella had said that you and that there was something between us from the past." And the silence stretched, exactly as long as silences do before a decision becomes irreversible. "Yes," Luciana said. Rodrigo didn't budge from the doorway. "Yes." Another longer silence. "Why didn't you say anything when you arrived?" Luciana breathed slowly. "Because you didn't recognize me, and because I thought it was better this way." "Better for whom?" "For both of us?" He paused. "For me, mostly." Rodrigo detached himself from the doorframe, stepped fully into the kitchen, and sat on the chair at the table, the same one he'd occupied that night in the early hours. He stared at his hands. "I looked for you," he said. After the course, I left a note at the academy. I know. How do you know? I found the letter in the study when I was cleaning. Rodrigo looked up. She read it. Yes. There was no reproach in the question, no reproach in the answer. Just two people telling each other the truth after a long time of not doing so. Then you know what it said. Yes. And Luciana looked at him directly. This was the moment. Not the one she had planned. Not with this preparation, or in these circumstances. But the moment nonetheless. Is there anything else I need to tell you? She asked. Something you don't know. Rodrigo waited, and Luciana spoke. She did so without preamble, without dramatic buildup. The same way she had learned to do difficult things. By going straight to the core, because the edges only prolong the pain. She told him about Samuel, told him his age, his name, that he lived with her sister in Medellin, that he was almost 3 years old, and that he was the real reason she had come to Bogotá, because she needed the money, and because there was something else she needed to resolve to move forward. Rodrigo listened to it all without interrupting. When she finished, the silence that followed was different from all the others that night. It was the silence of someone processing something that changed the entire map. The father, he asked finally, carefully, he's not around. He never was. Rodrigo nodded slowly. And why are you telling me this now? It was the right question, the only one that mattered. Luciana took a moment to answer. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted it to be exact. Because this morning, Isabella had broken something that didn't belong to her. And because carrying this truth alone already weighed more than she could bear. She paused. And because you have the right to know everything before I leave. Rodrigo looked at her. You're leaving. I think it's the right thing to do. After today, staying complicates everything. For whom? For you. Do you have enough with Isabella's situation? With the lawyers? With Luciana? He said it with a quiet firmness that cut the sentence at the exact point. I asked for whom. She didn't answer. Rodrigo stood up, walked to the kitchen window, and looked out at the building's interior patio, the same one Luciana gazed at on nights she couldn't sleep. I didn't recognize you either when you arrived, he said, his back to her. Or so I told myself. A long pause. But the first time I heard you speak to my mother from the hallway, I knew. I didn't want to know, but I knew. Luciana stood very still. Why didn't you say anything? Because I was afraid of what it meant. Because I was married. Because I had made decisions I couldn't undo overnight. He turned around. The same bad reasons people have when they choose not to see what's in front of them. They looked at each other from opposite ends of the kitchen. It wasn't a moment for resolution. It was too soon for that. Too many things were still broken on the floor. Too many lawyers and documents and decisions to be made. But it was the first real moment they had had in 3 years. The first one where neither of them was choosing not to see. Esteban called at 9 p.m. Rodrigo answered from the study. I have something, Esteban said without preamble. Gerardo Rios has an old complaint for irregular practice in Cali. It was dismissed, but the file exists, and there are 2 of Isabella's previous clients. He paused. From situations before you, who signed confidentiality agreements after separations. The amounts aren't public, but the lawyers are well known. Rodrigo took notes. What does that mean? That this isn't the first time she's done this, and if we find those clients and one of them talks, we have a pattern. A pattern is much harder to defend than an isolated case. How much time do you need? A week? Maybe less? Good. Rodrigo looked towards the hallway. Esteban. One more thing. Tell me. Luciana Prado. I want you to make sure she's legally protected if Isabella tries to do anything to harm her. A brief silence on the other end. Is there anything I should know? Yes, but I'll tell you tomorrow in person. Esteban took a moment. All right. And before you hang up, Rodrigo, you did well to call me. I didn't call you. My mother called me. A pause, and then, for the first time that endless night, something that was almost a smile in Esteban's voice. Of course, as always. Doña Amparo was awake when Luciana went to say goodnight. The elderly woman held the pendant in her hand, turning it between her fingers slowly, as she did when thinking of her husband. Did you speak with him? She asked, without looking up. Yes, everything. Luciana hesitated for a second. Almost everything. Doña Amparo looked up. The almost is always the most important part. I know, Señora Amparo. The elderly woman studied her for a moment, then extended her hand and took Luciana's wrist with a gentle firmness. What's his name? Luciana knew without asking what she was referring to. Samuel, Doña Amparo smiled. It was the first time Luciana had seen that smile on her, Not the usual kind one, but the other, the one that came from within. Samuel, she repeated, as if tucking the name away somewhere safe. Beautiful name. Luciana nodded, her throat tight. Good night, Senora Amparo. Good night, Luciana, she released her. And sleep, because tomorrow there's still much to resolve, and it's no use resolving it with eyes closed from exhaustion. Luciana turned off the light and closed the door. In the hallway, she stood for a moment with her back against the wall, eyes closed. Samuel, Rodrigo, the letter, the pendant, Esteban, Isabella, all together, all at once. She breathed and went to her room to call her son. The truth hurts more than the lie. Friday dawned gray over the hills of Bogota. Luciana got up before the alarm sounded. She dressed in silence, went to the kitchen, prepared the coffee, did everything with the same rhythm as always, the same movements, the same sequence of gestures she had repeated for months. But something inside was different, like loosening a knot that had been too tight for so long that one no longer remembered what it was like not to carry it. She had slept little but deeply, without the weight of what had been left unsaid. Rodrigo appeared at 7, not in a suit, but in simple clothes, as if he had decided that day was not a day for appearances. He poured himself coffee without saying anything and sat at the table. Luciana placed Doña Amparo's breakfast on the tray and prepared to take it to her. Luciana, she stopped. Thank you for everything yesterday. It wasn't just for the pendant, they both knew. You don't have to thank me, she said. Yes, I do. He said it without elaboration, with the simplicity of people when they finally say what is. Yes, I do. Luciana took the tray and went to Doña Amparo's room. The elderly woman was already awake, sitting in the chair by the window, the pendant in place, the book closed on her lap. She was looking at the hills with that expression of hers that suggested she was thinking of something that wasn't in a hurry. Leave the tray there, she said, and sit down for a moment. Luciana placed the breakfast on the small table and sat in the chair opposite. Doña Amparo looked at her directly, without the kind diversion of other days. When were you planning on leaving, Luciana? Don't tell me you weren't planning on leaving. I've known you for 6 months and I know how your face looks when you're calculating an exit. Luciana lowered her gaze for a moment. I thought that after yesterday, the cleanest thing to do was to leave, that everything that had happened here would be resolved without me complicating things. And Samuel? The name on Doña Amparo's lips still took her by surprise. That way she had of pronouncing it as if it already formed part of the inventory of people she cared about. Samuel is well with my sister. He's been well these past months. That's not what I asked. Doña Amparo rested the book on the small table. I asked about Samuel because I want you to understand something. What you carried alone all this time, that weight, you didn't have to carry it alone. And you don't have to keep carrying it alone either. Senora Amparo, Rodrigo's situation is complicated right now. The last thing he needs is... Do you know how old my son is? The question was so direct that Luciana took a second to answer. 42 years old. A company, a mother in a wheelchair, and he's just discovered his marriage was a transaction. Doña Amparo paused. Do you think he needs someone else to simplify his life by removing themselves from the picture? Or do you think he needs someone to stay, for once, even if it's complicated? Luciana didn't answer. Not because she didn't have one, but because she did, and it weighed on her. There's a difference, she said finally, carefully, between staying because you want to and staying because you feel you owe something. I don't want Rodrigo to feel he owes me anything. And if it's not debt, and if it's choice? Luciana. The elderly woman took her hand with that firmness of hers. I've seen my son in many states. I saw him build his company from nothing. I saw him lose his first marriage. I saw him alone for years without complaining, because he doesn't know how to complain. She squeezed his hand. And in 6 months, I've seen him look at you with an expression I haven't seen in a long time. That of someone who recognizes something they thought they had lost. The ensuing silence was the kind that didn't need filling. Have breakfast with us today, Doña Amparo finally said, releasing her hand. The 3 of us together, it's about time. Esteban arrived at 11 with news. He met with Rodrigo in the study, and this time the door was left ajar. Luciana didn't hear everything, but she heard enough as she passed through the hallway with the cleaning cart. Esteban had found one of Isabella's past associates, a woman from Medellin who had signed a confidentiality agreement 4 years ago, after a separation that had left her with half of what she had. The woman didn't want to speak publicly, but she had confirmed off the record that the method was the same. The lawyer Gerardo Rios, the same financial clause, the The same sequence. We can't use her as a witness, Esteban said, but we can use her as a pattern to build an argument for bad faith. And bad faith, he cleared his throat, changes everything in the legal framework of the clause. How much time? If we move this week, we can get a precautionary measure on the assets before she files a formal lawsuit. That gives us leverage. Move, Rodrigo said. Luciana kept walking. What followed Esteban's visit was more difficult. Rodrigo sought out Luciana on the terrace, where she was gathering some plants that Doña Amparo had in pots, and that the previous night's wind had overturned. Do you have a moment? Of course. They stood among the pots with the sky still gray over the city. I want to ask you something, Rodrigo said, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Luciana waited. I want you not to leave. It was simple. It was direct. It was exactly what it was, and it wasn't trying to be anything else. Rodrigo, for the first time in 6 months, had used her name without Señora in front of it. He noticed it the same instant he said it. He noticed it too. The situation with Isabella is going to be complicated in the coming weeks. If I stay here, she can build a narrative that harms you. She can say whatever she wants. It's not that simple. It is. Rodrigo looked at her with that expression he had when he had made a decision and was no longer evaluating. What Isabella built wasn't a marriage. It was a contract with an expiration date. That doesn't change whether you're here or not. What does change is something else. What? That you're leaving? I'll be left without the only person in this house who told my mom the truth when no one else would. Without the only person who spoke to me about fear when I thought I was talking about construction. She paused. Without the only person I know who carries a child of almost 3 years alone and doesn't complain and doesn't ask and doesn't demand, and who deserves someone to tell her she doesn't have to keep doing it alone. Luciana looked at her. Her eyes were dry. She had learned to keep them dry in important moments, but something in her jaw, something in the line of her shoulders had loosened without her asking. I don't know what's going to happen, she said. I have a son. I have a life in Medellin. I have things to resolve that don't get resolved overnight. I know that. And you have a divorce, lawyers, assets to protect, and a company to run. I know that too. So, what exactly are you asking for? Rodrigo thought for a moment. That I don't make the decision to leave because of you. That if you leave, it's because you want to leave, not because you think it's the easiest thing for others. Luciana looked at the overturned pots. She righted them one by one as she thought. Rodrigo didn't rush her. When she finished with the last one, she wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him. Give me time, she said. All the time you need. That afternoon, Luciana called Natalia. She didn't wait for the night. She called at 4 from her room, with the door closed and the phone pressed against her ear. Nati, I need to tell you something. What happened? Nothing bad, she breathed. I told Rodrigo about Samuel. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds, and Natalia finally said, with that voice of hers that carried 4 years of holding her sister's weight, without Luciana always asking her to. And I don't know yet, but he knows, and he didn't react the way I was afraid he would. How did he react? Luciana took a moment to answer calmly, respectfully. She paused. He asked me to stay. Natalia said nothing for a moment. Lou, tell me, you've been carrying that note from him folded in your pocket for 3 years. You've been telling yourself for 6 months that you're only there for work. Her voice was soft but direct. How much longer? You're going to convince yourself you don't want what you want. Luciana felt the sting of her sister's accuracy. It's complicated, Nati. Everything is complicated. Samuel was also complicated. And here we are. A pause. Do you want me to bring him? Who? Samuel. Do you want me to bring him to Bogotá? Luciana closed her eyes. The image came by itself. Samuel in that big kitchen. Samuel with Doña Amparo and her glasses and her book. Samuel saying, Mom, with that voice of absolute certainty that children have before the world teaches them doubt. Not yet, she said, but soon. How soon? Soon is soon, Nati. Her sister let out a breath. Okay. And then softer. Are you okay? Luciana looked at the wall of her room, the small room at the back of the apartment, where she had spent 6 months sleeping with a folded note at the bottom of her backpack. I'm better than yesterday, she said. That's something. That night, Rodrigo went to his mother's room, sat in front of her as he did as a child, in the low chair that no one used except him, and stayed silent for a moment, looking at the floor. Doña Amparo waited. Mom, tell me, why didn't you tell me before what you saw? About Isabella. What was happening? The old woman thought about it honestly. Because I told you. I told you that things get better or worse, that they don't stay the same. She paused. But there are things a son has to see for himself, Rodrigo. If I tell you everything, you don't see it. You only hear it. And hearing isn't the same as seeing. And about Luciana? Doña Amparo smiled. Luciana, I saw from the first day, from the moment she came into this room with 2 cups of coffee, and sat with me, without me having to ask her twice. And you didn't tell me anything either. Not either. She looked at him directly. Because that's not something you say either. It's something you see when you're ready to see it. Rodrigo nodded slowly. He has a son, he said. I know. You knew. I didn't know. I suspected. There are things that only have one explanation. And in Luciana's case, the explanation was always that she carried something she loved too much to talk about easily. Rodrigo stared at the necklace his mother wore. His name is Samuel, he said. Doña Amparo closed her eyes for a second. Samuel, she repeated. How old is he? A brief, warm silence. I want to meet him, she said simply. Rodrigo looked up. Mom, there are still many things that Rodrigo, she interrupted him softly. I'm 74 years old, and I have a wheelchair, and the time God grants me. I don't have time to wait for things to be perfect, to want to meet the people I care about. Rodrigo looked at her for a moment, then leaned forward and kissed her on the forehead. Good night, Mom. Good night, son. And as he was getting up, Rodrigo, what? This time, don't miss it. She didn't say it as a reproach, she said it as the last important thing a mother tells a son when she knows she doesn't need to repeat it anymore. Rodrigo turned off the light and closed the door. And in the hallway, he stood for a moment with his eyes closed, and something in his chest that wasn't pain, but it resembled it. The weight of everything it had cost to get here. Then he let it go and kept walking. The place where you should have always been. 3 weeks later, Bogotá woke up to sunshine. Not the timid sun of gray days that barely warms. The real sun. The one that comes down from the hills with clarity and fills apartments through large windows and makes even ordinary things look different. Luciana was in the kitchen when she heard the doorbell. Natalia arrived with Samuel by the hand. The child entered the apartment with the seriousness that almost 3-year-olds have when they are in a new place, looking at everything, evaluating, without letting go of his aunt's hand yet. He had his mother's curly hair and dark eyes, and that way of standing with his feet firmly planted on the ground, that Luciana recognized even if she didn't know where it came from. Samuel, Luciana said, kneeling in front of him. The child looked at her for a second, and then let go of Natalia's hand and went straight to her. Mom? Luciana hugged him with both arms tightly, with that kind of hug that isn't a greeting, but a recognition. Samuel buried his face in her neck, and she closed her eyes and breathed. And for a moment the entire architecture of the last few months, the months of carrying alone and calculating alone and deciding alone, finally became something that made sense to have gone through. Natalia watched them from the entrance with that older sister smile of hers that has waited a long time for this. Hello, she said in a low voice. Hello, Nati. Luciana stood up with Samuel in her arms. Thank you for coming. How could I not come? Rodrigo arrived at the apartment at noon. He was coming from a meeting with Esteban. Things with Isabella were moving in the right direction. The preliminary injunction on the assets had been accepted. Gerardo Rios's file had officially come to light, and there were indications that Isabella, assessing the situation, was beginning to consider an out-of-court settlement. Esteban was handling it with the efficiency of someone who has waited 12 years to be able to use everything he knows. Rodrigo opened the apartment door and heard a voice he hadn't heard in that house before. A small voice. He followed the sound from the living room. In the living room, Doña Amparo was in her wheelchair next to the low table, and in front of her, sitting on the floor with his legs crossed and an extraordinary seriousness, was a child with curly hair who was looking with absolute concentration at the chess pieces the old woman had arranged on the board. Doña Amparo said, picking up a knight and placing it in front of the child. This is called a knight. Can you say knight? The child took it with both hands. Knight, he said. Almost. Knight, knight. Doña Amparo smiled with a patience and warmth that Rodrigo hadn't seen in her for years, perhaps since he himself was a child. Enough for today, she said. The knight is yours. Samuel clutched the piece against his chest with absolute satisfaction. Rodrigo stood at the entrance of the living room, without saying anything. Doña Amparo looked up and saw him, and in her expression there was something calm and complete, like the face someone makes when something they've long awaited finally happens exactly as they expected. "You're here," she said simply. "I'm here, Mom." "Samuel, this gentleman is the owner of the night." The child looked up at Rodrigo. He evaluated him with that direct gaze that children have before they learn to hide what they think. "Mine," Samuel said, clutching the piece tighter. Doña Amparo let out a short, genuine laugh. "Rodrigo, too. It's yours," Rodrigo said. "Keep it." Samuel nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has just resolved a negotiation in his favor and returned his attention to the board. Luciana found them like that when she returned from accompanying Natalia to the door. She stopped at the entrance of the living room, Rodrigo looking at her from across the room, Doña Amparo with her calm smile, Samuel on the floor with the chess knight clutched in his hands. It was an image she hadn't planned, hadn't calculated, that didn't fit into any of the scenarios she had built during all those months of measuring and controlling and deciding with her head what her heart had already decided long ago. "How did it go?" Rodrigo asked her. "Well," she said, "Esteban called while you were arriving. He told me to tell you that the judge signed this morning." "I know. I already spoke with him." A brief moment. Normal. So normal that it hurt a little for how much it had cost to get there. Samuel looked up from the board. "Mom," he said. "Night." "I see, my love." "Mine, yours, yes." The child returned to the board, satisfied. Doña Amparo looked at both of them with her characteristic serenity of someone who has lived enough to know when something is in its place. "I'm going to rest for a while," she announced, adjusting her hands on the arms of her chair. "Samuel, will you accompany me?" The child got up from the floor with the knight still in his hand and went to her side without anyone asking him twice. Doña Amparo began to move towards the hallway, and Samuel walked beside her, serious and formal, as if accompanying an elderly lady in a wheelchair was exactly what he had planned to do with his afternoon. At the entrance to the hallway, the old woman stopped and looked back once. She said nothing, just looked at them and continued. Rodrigo and Luciana were left alone in the living room. The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows, giving everything that quality of things that have already happened and don't need explaining. Rodrigo went to where she was, unhurried, with that calm of decisions that have already been made and are just waiting for the moment to be named. "What happens now?" Luciana asked. It was the same question as always, the one she had been asking silently since the first day she crossed that door. "Now many things happen," Rodrigo said. "The divorce will take time. The legal situation will be complicated for a couple of months." He paused. "Samuel needs a stable place. You need to stop living as if you were going to leave at any moment." "I don't know how to live any other way." "I know." He took another step. "That's why I'm asking you to learn here. Where can I see you?" Luciana looked at him. She had spent 3 years carrying a folded note in her pocket. She had spent 6 months telling herself she was only there for work. She had spent her entire adult life learning that difficult things carry themselves, because asking for help was a luxury she couldn't always afford. And now she was here in this living room with the sun coming through the windows, with her son learning to say night in an old woman's room. He adopted her in 5 minutes with a man telling her to stay in a way that was neither debt, nor pity, nor obligation, but choice. Rodrigo said, "Tell me when I stop being your boss." He waited. "We have to talk about many things, all you want. Difficult things too. And I don't know how it's going to turn out. Neither do I." He looked at her. "But I know I want to find out. And I know the only way to find out is without either of us looking at the exit door while we talk." Luciana looked down for a moment, then looked up. "Okay," she said. It wasn't a movie ending. There was no music or dramatic gesture. It was just that. 2 people saying okay to each other in a living room with the afternoon sun, with a child in the next room learning the names of the chess pieces, with all the complicated things still ahead, and for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel like a threat. That night, after Samuel fell asleep in the room Luciana had prepared for him, with the things Natalia had brought in her suitcase, Luciana went to the living room window. Bogotá was lit up below, the hills dark and still in the background, the same landscape as always, but seen from a different place, from the place of someone who stays. Rodrigo entered the living room and stopped beside her. They said nothing for a moment. "Is he asleep?" he asked. "Like a log." It took him 5 minutes. A pause. "He has your energy in reverse. You don't stop until you stop completely." Rodrigo looked at her. It was the first joke, the first thing said without calculation. Luciana noticed it the moment she said it and didn't know whether to laugh or not. Rodrigo smiled slowly. 3 years, and you only know me from a note and a letter, he said. And from how you write about construction when you're really writing about fear. He let out a breath with something that was almost a laugh. That was 4 years ago. People don't change that much. No, he looked at her. They don't change that much. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't weigh down, the kind one can inhabit without any effort. Outside, Bogota went on. The cars, the lights, the noise muffled by the glass, the world functioning with its usual indifference to the small and enormous things that happen inside apartments. Tomorrow, Luciana said, we have to talk about the practicalities. Tomorrow and the day after too. And there will be difficult days, many probably. And Samuel has a championship tantrum when he doesn't get enough sleep. Rodrigo looked at her sideways. I can handle that. You don't know what you're saying. Probably not. A pause. But I want to know. Luciana looked at him. She held that gaze for a long moment, without hurrying. Fine, he said at last. And that single word, spoken without drama and without impossible promises, was enough. Because sometimes the biggest things don't fit into big sentences. Sometimes they fit exactly into that, into a truly said fine, in front of a window with a sleeping child in the next room, and an old woman who already knew the ending before either of them saw it. Doña Amparo, in her room, held the pendant between her fingers in the darkness. She wasn't praying, just thinking. She thought of her husband, who had once told her that families don't always arrive complete from the beginning, that sometimes they are built slowly with pieces that seem not to fit, until suddenly they do. She thought of Samuel saying, "Night," with that seriousness of a child who takes everything seriously. She thought of Rodrigo looking at Luciana with an expression she hadn't seen in a long time. She thought that 74 years are enough to see many things that don't turn out well, and also, occasionally, the ones that do. She closed her fingers over the pendant. "There," she said in the darkness, very softly, as if speaking to someone not in the room, but whom she felt close to nonetheless. "There." And she fell asleep with the calm of those who have seen enough to know that this time things were indeed turning out.